It was the summer of 1952, and in a small factory in Pasadena, California, a man was working on a rush order for a film set, when suddenly, he dropped a coffee can. To an outsider, nothing would seem wrong about this scene, but in fact, this was hardly the case. You see, that can did not contain any coffee. The man was using it to mix fulminate mercury, highly explosive material. That order was also not ordinary. It was an order for a batch of explosives, and the man was finishing it up in an explosives factory. So when that can hit the floor, it was no surprise what happened next. Miraculously, the man wasn't killed instantly, but he would die from complications in a matter of minutes. You'd probably assume this man was a complete idiot for doing what he did, but this man was no idiot. He was Jack Parsons, one of the most important rocket scientists in the field of aeronautics. He was also an occultist who believed in sex rituals to commune with God, so, yeah. Okay, let's start with the basics. Jack was born in October of 1914 in Los Angeles. As a child, he wasn't the best student around, performing poorly throughout his academic career. Regardless, he spent most of his time reading science fiction stories from pulp magazines, which were like cheap magazines that were filled with fantastical stories. If you ever seen a cover like this, or this, you get the gist of it. However, through these stories, he'd come to have an interest in rockets and space travel. This would manifest itself in the real world, where with his friend Ed Foreman, he experimented with all sorts of explosives. From firecrackers to cherry bombs, they combined them into rockets. However, because of his failing grades, his mother sent him to Brown Military Academy for Boys, a private boarding school in San Diego. But he was expelled for blowing up toilets. The Parsons' inspiration, pulp novels weren't just rockets and spacemen. There were also mystery, romance, and horror. Through these stories, a young Jack would gain an interest in the occult. Just like rockets, this would manifest itself in the real world, where he performed a ritual to summon demons in his bedroom. Thinking it worked, he was scared shitless and vowed to never dabble in the occult again. So in the meantime, he got back to rockets. By 1934, he dropped out of college due to the depression and found his way to Caltech, self-taught in chemistry and with an idea. What if he could truly use rockets to explore the cosmos? At the time, the consensus in the scientific community was that the idea was nothing more than another story in one of Jack's pulp novels. But at Caltech, Parsons met Frank Molina, one of the few respected scientists who not only studied rocketry, but believed in space travel. Together, along with his friend Ed Foreman, they formed the Galsit Rocket Research Group. On collaborative rocket development, Parsons was the chemist, Foreman the machinist, and Manila the technical theatrician. They'd start by making small rocket prototypes that would start with classic gunpowder, conducting their work in the Mojave Desert, because Caltech didn't love the idea of three men blowing themselves up on campus. While they advanced slightly past their archaic technology, the Suicide Squad, as they were called on campus, found out that gunpowder ultimately had major flaws, not to mention a boatload of craters all over the desert. You see, gunpowder is a mix of charcoal, sulfur, and potassium nitrate. When they get flung into the air on a rocket, the rocket shakes these substances around. This causes them to demix, leaving the bigger charcoal particles on the top and pushing the smaller particles down. Sort of like if you had a bag of coins, and if you shook it around, you'd have the quarters on top and the dimes on the bottom. This is where Parsons' skills as a chemist came in. He devised a more stable and reliable version of liquid rocket fuel. He'd put the ingredients oxygen on one side and a combination of methyl alcohol and nitrogen flowing in from the other side, so that they would proportionally react throughout the flight. The first attempt failed, and so did the second, the third, and the fourth. But for Parsons, the fifth time was the charm. And that success, along with the publicized testimony Parsons gave about car bombs, it's a whole other story, by the way, but anyway, would finally give the group the notoriety they needed to get their own respected space on the Caltech campus, along with some legitimacy. Yay. By the time 1939 rolled around, the Army had a problem on their hands, as well as some money to throw at it. The problem was that many places around the world, the Army did not have the means to get their planes off the ground. That's when they found our trio, who were tasked to find out just how feasible it was for a rocket to be strapped on a plane to help it take off. It turned out it was really feasible, and thus, jet-assisted takeoff was born. The word rocket was still taboo, so they just called them jets.
This added power cuts the takeoff run from a third to more than a half in length. Now our big carriers will be able to carry more planes on deck and get them into battle faster.
Of course, their explosion-fueled past still made Caltech weary of anything involving Parsons and rockets, and thus, they were exiled from the main campus almost as quickly as they arrived. They moved to a small patch of land owned by the college in a canyon near Flint Ridge. While it was only some unventilated iron shacks when they got there, they dubbed it the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or JPL for short. Slowly and painstakingly, they built off their two-part feeder system and developed a more practical theory of rocket motors. They also invented propellant combinations that were more robust and storable than oxygen, methyl alcohol, and nitrogen. What's more important is that these new liquid and solid propellants fueled working engines, in contrast to their explosion makers of the past. It was perfect timing too, as around the same time, a certain global military conflict was brewing, a world war if you will, one where rockets were being used by the enemy for harm. And for the US, it seemed inevitable they would join.
Black smoke billowed to the sky as the massive control tower began to keel over. The Arizona's courageous crew stuck to its guns until the very end. Here was displayed heroism that will live forever in the glorious annals and traditions of the American Navy.
The JTOW rocket Galsant made for the Army would become an invaluable tool in the logistics game in every theater of the war. By the end of the war, the group had created numerous rockets for the Army and had finally acquired the specifications to the V-2 missile, as well as the scientists behind it, via Operation Paperclip. It turned out they were still using the primitive oxygen, methyl alcohol, and nitrogen mixture Parsons had come up with in 1934. While the Germans had proven Galsant's practical ideas of rocketry, they could make it better. And again, the timing couldn't have been more perfect, as another war, a certain Cold War, if you will, was brewing. One where rockets would play a much bigger role. As the Cold War grew in scale, the need for a quick, precise, and cost-effective method of nuclear annihilation grew as well. With Parsons' advancement in liquid fuel and solid rocket fuel motors, he was the perfect choice for the new Navajo missile program. The crew would use a rocket similar to the JTOW rocket as a means of gaining enough speed for the new technology, a jet engine that compresses incoming air using the aircraft's speed instead of a turbine called a ramjet to be able to pass through compressed air to move stably at cruise speed. Building on Parsons' work, as well as the concepts from German scientists, they came up with what would be the granddaddy of all rocket engines, the XLR-71. Even though the Navajo would eventually lose out to the Atlas rocket system as the premier missile system, its impact on American rocketry is felt even today. It's like the Quake of rocket engines. Though as you may know, the Cold War had another front, espionage. Parsons wasn't a spy, but he was still put in the crosshairs of the House Un-American Activities Committee. They deemed him un-American and barred him from working with the government ever again. Why was he deemed such? Due to his connections to the occult. Okay, so this is the part of the video where I talk about Thelema, but I gotta go over what exactly Thelema is before I go over how Parsons was impacted by it. The short answer would be that it's a cult. The long answer is that Thelema is a spiritual philosophy created by Aleister Crowley, a British occultist who, depending on who you asked, was either a genius or a madman, or both. The core of Thelema is summed up by the phrase, "Do what thou wilt, shall be the whole of the law." Sounds cool, right? Well, it's a bit more complicated than just doing whatever you want. There's also a whole pantheon of deities involved, including Horus, the Egyptian god of war, who Crowley claimed wrote the religion's holy book, the Book of the Law, in 1904. The idea is that everyone has a true will, a kind of cosmic destiny, and your goal in life is to figure out what it is and to follow it. To get there, Thelemites practice rituals, meditation, and in some cases, very unconventional activities. Parsons would start his story with the group in 1939, around the same time the JTO project began. Looking back to his dabblings with the occult in his youth, Parsons was fascinated by Thelema and would begin interacting more through the course of the year. The more he learned about their teachings, the more his attractions grew. To Parsons, rocketry and thelemic magic were two sides of the same coin. He saw them both as ways to escape the physical world, one physically through rockets, and the other spiritually through magic. He'd try to show other members of JPL his beliefs, and would intertwine them with the life at the lab. Famously, he'd sing an ode to a Greek god, Pan, before every test launch, though most people shrugged it off as him being an eccentric quack. As time went on, religion wasn't just a set of ideas for Parsons to think about. It became a lifestyle. One of the big parts of Thelema's teachings was that one must elevate themselves spiritually through sex. He believed that his sexual rituals could summon supernatural entities, open gateways to other dimensions, or bring about cosmic transformations. So when Parsons joined the church officially in the end of 1939, sex wasn't just about pleasure or love. It was a direct link to power, magic, and the divine. He would throw parties that were centered around massive orgies. He would invite all sorts of socialites from nearby Hollywood, as well as anyone interested in the occult. One such man that would find his way to Parsons' circle would be L. Ron Hubbard. Now, this name may or may not ring a bell to anyone interested in weird religions and the likes, but the organization he founded most certainly will. Scientology. However, when he first met Parsons, he was just a pulp novel writer who had been discharged from the Navy for overall being a shitty seaman. Hubbard, who was homeless at the time, befriended Jack and moved into his mansion with him and Jack's girlfriend, Sarah. While there, they would try to push the boundaries of magic rituals. Jack would conduct black magic and voodoo rituals in hopes of contacting otherworldly beings, while Hubbard would act as a sort of transcriber of events. It's believed that the shift in Parsons' magical inclinations were a result of Sarah becoming more interested in Hubbard than Jack. Since Thelema promoted polyamory, Jack could do nothing but feel jealous. Regardless, they would conduct numerous rituals, doing everything from imbuing objects with spirits to trying to outright summon gods, all involving copious amounts of sex, of course. In 1946, Hubbards would present Parsons with a proposition. They, along with Sarah, would buy 3 yachts in Miami and sail them through the Panama Canal to sell on the West Coast for a major markup. Since the supply of luxury yachts was smaller in the Pacific than in the Atlantic, it was a reasonable idea. Parsons loved the idea so much that he put his entire life savings into the plan. The only problem was that Hubbard and Sarah had other plans. They would head to Miami ahead of Jack, and they would take the boats on a trip across the world together. Effectively, Hubbard had stolen both Jack's money and his girl, leaving him with almost nothing to his name. Banished from rocketry and with hardly anything to his name, Parsons would start an explosives factory with a woman called Marjorie Cameron, whom he met through his sex magic days. He hoped to make enough money to move to Israel to get back into the rocketry business, which was starting to shape up in the Levant. However, a certain rush order for a movie set would ensure that this never happened. Jack Parsons died on June 17th, 1952. While the man was gone, his ideas spread and grew, both in the scientific world and in the occult. His final words, "But I'm not finished yet," were eerily fitting.